Alright, so today I want to compare the dark morphs in ball pythons. Kind of have a battle of the dark morphs to see which one is the darkest. As a matter of fact, you can actually mix a lot of the dark morphs with other genes and other combinations and get some really darkened backgrounds when you mix it in. And some have a greater effect and some have a lesser effect. And I'd say it really depends on which genes that you actually mix them with. And sometimes it really depends on the line of the specific dark morph too. Sometimes you can have certain lines that are a lot darker than the others. Sometimes we kind of mix them all together. Probably one of the biggest ones that's really variable is cinnamon. Sometimes you can have really dark cinnamons and sometimes you can have a reddish brown cinnamon, and it's kind of the same with all genes. You have little subtleties within the gene as far as kind of the variations within the specific morph. So today I want to jump over the internet and I want to have a battle of the dark morphs. Alright, so I want to jump over here on Morphmarket.com and I want to start with some of these dark genes just by themselves and show you what they look like as a standalone morph. And then I want to show you the super, 2 copies of the gene, so you can get an idea what the supers look like and kind of compare them. And then I want to show you those dark genes mixed with the banana. This is what the banana looks like. And the banana, I'd say, is probably the most visually dominant morph in all of ball pythons. If you're going to darken something and you want to be impressive darkening a gene, you can actually mix it with banana. As a matter of fact, there's one more visually dominant than this, and that would be the albino. But the problem is you mix any dark morph with the albino and you get an albino looking snake. It doesn't really kind of shine through. I'd say probably the best gene that we can use is the banana. So the first one I want to start with is this one right here. This is the blackhead. And let me tell you, the blackhead I've always considered to be the darkest gene of all the dark morphs. And essentially what it is, it almost looks like a normal in a lot of cases, but you'll see the background is like a real dark inkjet color, really super black. And a lot of times they'll have a super jet black head. I think that's where they get the name blackhead. And if you mix it with a lot of genes, you usually get a really big influence as far as darkening the overall combination. And here's what the super blackhead looks like. Take a look at this. And kind of the interesting thing about all these genes is sometimes the supers can be darker than the kind of the general effect when you're mixing it with other genes. The blackhead, the super blackhead, is a really super black top to it. It is really super black, but you can definitely tell on this one, it has quite a bit of pattern and color coming through, almost like a goldish, and the pattern is almost kind of streaked out on the side. Pretty interesting combination. And here's what happens if you work in blackhead into the banana. Take a look at this. This is a really strong influence, really darkening the banana. It has a really big influence. You can definitely tell it really darkened. Even kind of the orange parts of the snake it really darkened, and especially the background and even the head. Pretty incredible. So here is the leopard, and the leopard is kind of interesting because I've always thought it to be kind of a pseudo dark morph. As a matter of fact, I've actually looked at a few leopard banana combinations and I didn't think it really darkened that much, and I actually was doing this video and I come to find out that the leopard actually does have quite a bit of an influence on the coral glows and the bananas, more than I actually thought. And here's what the super leopard looks like. Take a look at this. It almost looks like a leopard, which is kind of interesting. As a matter of fact, I didn't even think the super leopard existed, and I keep seeing these snakes over here on Morphmarket that says this is the leopard or the super leopard. So apparently a super leopard does exist, and from what I can see over here, it almost looks exactly like the leopard. So if you have just one copy of the leopard and you breed it to something else, half the offspring come out as leopard. But if you have 2 copies, if you actually have a super leopard, whatever you breed it to, everything comes out as a leopard because it has 2 copies of the gene. So here's what happens if you work leopard into the banana. Take a look at this. This was kind of surprising for me that the leopard is actually kind of having more of an effect than I thought with a lot of these bananas and coral glows out there. I'd say it's not, probably nowhere near like the kind of the level of the blackhead. The blackhead is pretty much the #1 winner so far compared to the leopard. But the leopard is kind of interesting. Usually the leopard will really jumble up the pattern. And I was actually surprised that the pattern wasn't more jumbled up on this specific example. Pretty amazing combination. So here is the Black Pastel. The Black Pastel is another dark morph. As a matter of fact, the Black Pastel, if you actually mix two of them together and get the super, you get a completely black patternless snake, which is pretty interesting. So take a look at this. This is the super Black Pastel. And when it comes to probably the darkest super of all the dark morphs, I'd say the super Black Pastel is probably the darkest of the dark. It darkens the whole thing. I've seen some of these that are like almost completely jet black, and it kind of varies a little bit. I've seen some super black pastels that are kind of like a dark rusty brown color, but I'd say generally you see a lot of them that are really super black. And here's what happens if you work black pastel into the banana. Take a look at this. It influences, it really darkens the background, but it doesn't really darken it as much as the Blackhead. I'd say this is probably underneath the Blackhead, maybe above the Leopard, so you can kind of rank them. And kind of the interesting thing is I was actually looking over here and I saw, you know, the banana black pastel. I saw some that were a little bit lighter and a little bit darker. So I was trying to pick a snake that was kind of in the mid-range as far as representing the combination, as far as kind of the average darkness for kind of the ones that I saw over here on Morphmarket. So here is the GHI. The GHI stands for gotta have it. You definitely gotta have it. And GHI is another dark morph. And the cool thing I like about GHI is that it really jumbles up the pattern. Sometimes you can get some really crazy pattern enhancements working GHI in a lot of combinations. And the super GHI, take a look at this. This is what the super GHI looks like. It looks almost like a GHI, but you can definitely tell it has a darker sides in most cases. In a lot of cases, the super GHI actually kind of wipes out the pattern. You can see just a faint pattern on the side of the snake. It's definitely different than just one copy of the GHI. And here's what happens if you work GHI into a banana. Take a look at this crazy snake. That is pretty wild. I just love the way it really jumbles up the pattern and darkens it. That is an amazing combo. As far as being, you know, kind of on a level of darkness, I'd say this is probably on par with maybe Black Pastel, where it darkens quite a bit. So here is the cinnamon, and believe it or not, the cinnamon's actually allelic with black pastel. So you can take a cinnamon, breed it to a black pastel, and you get kind of like a pseudo super. It looks like a black patternless snake that is called an 8-ball, the combination of cinnamon and black pastel. And here's what happens if you work cinnamon into the super. This is the super cinnamon. You have two copies of the cinnamon. Some of these are like a reddish brown color. And I'd say this is a little bit darker than some of your super cinnamons. Some of them almost looks like super black pastels, and I'm thinking some people may get a little bit confused when they're actually breeding these together. So for example, you could take like two 8-balls and breed them together, and you'd actually get some super cinnamons and some super black pastels, which could maybe easily get confused. So I think a lot of times over here on Morphmarket, I see a lot of these combinations, and I always wonder, you know, I wonder if someone actually mixed up the cinnamons and the black pastels in some of these breedings, and some of them look almost interchangeable when you look at some of the extremes. I've seen some super cinnamons that look almost exactly like super black pastels. But here's what happens if you work cinnamon into the banana. Take a look at this. This is kind of interesting because it really doesn't darken it as much as the black pastel, which is kind of expected. I'd say most of your cinnamons are a little bit reddish brown, kind of a not quite as jet black as you'd see in the black pastel. So I say the black pastel is probably a little bit more darkening as far as, you know, kind of the king, you know, kind of ranking the dark morphs as far as the darkest to the lightest. And it's really hard to actually have a number system and number them like from 1 all the way down because of the variability. But I'd say cinnamon is probably under black pastel. So here is the Mahogany. The Mahogany is another dark morph. The Mahogany is kind of interesting. If you actually make the super with 2 copies of the Mahogany, you get what is known as the Suma. And this is what the Suma looks like. And the Suma is kind of interesting. It almost looks like, kind of like a super black pastel, a completely black patternless snake. But a lot of times on the Suma, you'll have like this coppery gold color. And a lot of times on some Sumas, you'll have like this coppery line right down the top of the snake. You really can't see it that much on this one, but in some cases it's really pronounced, a really strong line. And here's what happens if you work Mahogany into the banana. Take a look at this. This is pretty interesting. As a matter of fact, I was kind of surprised on this one. This is actually below the Leopard. I thought the Leopard was kind of on the edge of being a dark morph. And coming over here, looking at the Mahogany, it looks like the Mahogany is even under the Leopard, which is pretty amazing. There's quite a few examples, and they all seem to be a little bit lighter than a lot of the dark morphs. So here is the chocolate. The chocolate's pretty interesting. The chocolate is another dark morph. If you mix two chocolates together, you get the super chocolate, and that looks like this, the super chocolate. And it's kind of weird, some of these genes, if you actually mix them together and make the supers, a lot of times it doesn't really reflect how they will react with some of the other combinations. This is not really the darkest super that I've seen, which is pretty interesting. And here's what happens if you work chocolate into banana. Take a look at how dark this is. This is pretty surprising that the chocolate really darkens the banana. So the question is who is the winner and who is the loser? Which is the darkest and which is the lightest as far as mixing dark morphs in? And I'd say probably number one has to be probably this one right here, the Blackhead. This is the Blackhead banana. Look at how dark that is. And pretty much everything I've seen over on Morphmarket, you mix Blackhead into it and you get some of the darkest combos. But it's kind of interesting, you look at the super Blackhead, you can see it's super dark on top, but it still has some of the light, kind of a pattern on the side, which is kind of interesting. It almost seems like the super black pastel is almost darker than the super Blackhead because it's completely jet black through the whole snake, which is kind of interesting. And I'd say probably this would be number one as far as the Blackhead being the darkest gene, and probably the lightest as far as what I've seen is, let's see if I can actually find this. This is probably the Mahogany. Mixing the Mahogany in with the banana, I've seen some of the lightest, the kind of the least amount of influence as far as darkening the background, which is kind of interesting because the super Mahogany is a pretty dark snake, which is and kind of the other ones in the middle. I'd say if I had to choose like the number two, I don't even know which one I would choose. I'd say maybe, let's see, probably the black pastel, I would say is probably the number two. This is the banana black pastel. So probably number one would be the Blackhead, number two, black pastel. And you know, the Leopard is kind of in the middle, which kind of surprised me. It's not on the bottom, which I thought it was. That was kind of interesting. And the Mahogany, I'd say, is probably in the last place for the darkest morph. All right, so it's time for the question of the day. And Annabelle Lee asks, how do I get my ball python to transition from eating mice to eating rats? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, that's probably one of the most frustrating parts about keeping ball pythons. You can get those certain snakes that will absolutely refuse to eat rats and they get stuck on mice. And I pretty much think what it comes down to is timing when you're raising those ball pythons. So when a ball python comes out of the egg, when it's a first brand new hatchling, the only thing that I've found that they will really reliably eat is mice. You pretty much have to start on mice, and then I'd say after you feed maybe 10 to 15 mice, they kind of transition into this phase where they'll eat absolutely anything. It's kind of funny, when they first come out of the egg, they're super picky, and then once they start eating, they just kind of go ballistic to the point where you go up to your hatchling rack and you open up the rack and they just come flying out of the tub like crazy. And that is the point that you should switch them from mice over to rats. And probably, you know, if it was my suggestion to you, I'd probably never go back to mice, and I would only keep them on rats at that point because a lot of times they can get stuck on mice. But I have to admit, here in my collection, what I kind of do is I kind of go back and forth between mice and rats for a lot of my hatchling. Really depends on what I have available at the time, because I raise my own rats, and, you know, sometimes I'll have kind of a limited supply of one or the other, so I kind of go back and forth. But let me tell you, you definitely want to get them on rats as soon as you can and keep them on rats. And as a matter of fact, if you actually start feeding feeding them rats and they stop eating and get real picky, you can actually go back to mice and kind of backtrack for a few feedings and then try rats again. And if you have a mouser, one that will only eat mice, sometimes you can actually trick them into eating a rat, and sometimes you can convert them, but it takes quite a bit. And a couple of tricks you can try is to take like a frozen thawed mouse and a frozen thawed rat and put them in a baggie and thaw them out at the same time and kind of scent the rat with the mouse. So it kind of looks like the same. As a matter of fact, you can actually take a rat that is the same color as the mouse and about the same size and thaw them in the same bag. Sometimes that'll trick them, and a lot of times what you can do is you can actually feed the mouse first and then wait about half an hour and then follow up with the rat and see if they'll actually go back to back, a mouse and a rat. And sometimes that'll work and sometimes it won't. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.